Guys, welcome to another Guts and Glory World War II podcast. Okay, so Chapter 13, The Mighty Eighth, The Flight of Cabin in the Sky, the Third, February 20th, 1944, Leipzig, Germany. Hitler built a fortress around Europe, but he forgot to put a roof on it. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Bandits incoming, 3 o'clock high. The sudden thumping of 12 machine guns, all blasting at once, jolted the 15-ton four-engine aircraft, but United States Army Air Force Lieutenant William R. Lawley, Jr. held it steady. The rumbling propellers roared as he pushed open the throttle and careened through a thick black cloud of anti-aircraft smoke at nearly 300 miles an hour. He had to keep in tight formation with hundreds of our gigantic explosive-filled aircraft that are roughly the same size as those 737 airliners you see at the airport these days. Overhead, a pair of ultra-fast Nazi Focke-Wulf 190 fighter planes zoomed by, ripping off thousands of rounds from twin-linked machine guns and heavy autocannons. White tracer fire whizzed past the cockpit, while other bullets punched holes through the sides of the plane with the unsettling ping of steel on steel. Black puffs of enemy artillery popped up all around Lawley's massive aircraft, each one representing a ship incinerating surface-to-air artillery shell bursting into a fearsome-looking cloud of screaming hot shrapnel. The enemy fighters whipped past at speeds of over 400 miles an hour, passing so close to Lawley's windshield that if he hadn't been so busy trying to keep his crew alive, he probably would have told you the color of the pilot's eyes. As the gray Nazi fighters dove down toward another squadron of American bombers below, Lawley's starboard waist gunner zeroed in on them with a quick burst of tracer fire from his .50 caliber machine gun, but had to release the trigger as a pair of American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter planes dropped in to chase them. It was February 20th, 1944, and Lieutenant Lawley's Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was at the head of a formation of 1,000 bombers sent to flatten Germany's production and aircraft manufacturing facilities into smoldering rubble. For some strange reason, the Germans were doing their best to make it difficult for the Americans to do this. In early 1944, Nazi Germany was still reeling from the grinding defeat at the Battle of Kursk, and now was being forced back all along the Eastern Front. The Allies were like, okay, cool, this is great and all, but total victory over Hitler's goose-stepping minions means a war on two fronts. This meant that at some point there would have to be a joint American-British full-scale invasion of Europe through France to squeeze out Hitler's forces, but that was easier said than done. Hitler had spent the last 4 years turning the entire French coastline into a so-called Fortress Europe, bristling with cannons and aircraft from Calais to the Pyrenees. Much of the way, the Luftwaffe had needed to take out Britain's air defenses to mount a successful invasion of the British Isles. Now the Allies needed to plaster the German military with a few million tons of high explosives and grind it into ash before attempting a full-blown attack into France. The cleverly nicknamed Big Week was the Allied plan to spend 7 days ruthlessly airmailing explosives to enemy aircraft production facilities, day and night. Wave after wave of American B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and British Lancasters blasted shipyards, railroad junctions, power plants, airfields, steel production facilities, dams, and military bases. They ignited everything from ball-bearing plants to oil refineries, turning them into towering explosive fireballs, making it really, really hard for anyone in Germany to build a working fighter plane. These gigantic bomber raids were nothing new for Lieutenant Lawley. A 23-year-old Alabama boy, this veteran pilot had already flown 9 missions over Germany in the last year, running through a brutal gauntlet of anti-aircraft cannons and enemy fighter planes every single time. This was his 10th mission, but his first at the controls of a brand new B-17. It was nicknamed Cabin in the Sky 3 because the first two Cabin in the Sky aircraft under Lawley's command had already been blown up. As a side note, Cabin was named after a musical that marked the first on-screen appearance of the moonwalk dance that Michael Jackson made so famous in the 80s, a fact that contributes very little to World War II history, but is still cool. Lawley's target was an aircraft production plant in Leipzig, a German fortress city just 2 hours from downtown Berlin. The Nazis, fighting on their own turf, were determined to stop Lawley and his buddies from pulverizing them. Flying Fortress wasn't just a clever name for the Boeing B-17 bomber. This behemoth had a 4-engine, 18-ton armored tank with wings and enough machine guns to carve a small mountain into something resembling a giant chunk of Swiss cheese. It had a crew of 10. Pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, navigator, bombardier, and radio man all worked together to bring the plane into position and release the bombs. And then there were 4 guys assigned as machine gunners. The ball turret gunners sat in the suicide seat, a cramped little circular dome popping out from under the airplane that looked like those plastic balls you see at McDonald's play place. It sported twin 50 caliber machine guns and swiveled a full 360 degrees. The tail gunner wedged himself into a tiny compartment in the back of the aircraft and was responsible for taking out enemy fighters that dropped behind the B-17. There were also 2 machine gunners in the waist of the plane, each manning a gun facing a different side, and the top-mounted double machine gun turret for the flight engineer, and the front-facing double machine gun turret sticking out below the cockpit for the bombardier. Then pack everything into an armored hull capable of withstanding extreme punishment from enemy aircraft, and you got, well, a flying fortress. Over 400 of these bombers partied over Leipzig as the B-17s of American 8th Air Force made their attack run. Peering through the mostly accurate state-of-the-art Norden bomb sights and updating their calculations, bombardiers zeroed in on their targets and let fly, sending thousands of pounds of high explosives pummeling 5 miles to the earth to explode in a carpet of flame and shrapnel. In his rumbling cockpit, braving temperatures running to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, Lieutenant Lawley breathed oxygen through a gas mask because this was back before cool things like pressurized heated aircraft existed. Holding the plane perfectly steady to give his bombardier a stable firing platform was risky, as it made Lawley's B-17 a pretty cherry target for German ground gunners, but that was one of the risks they had to take. Bomb explosions rippled the German countryside like a handful of rocks thrown into a lake, each pop representing a leveled building or factory. But on Cabin in the Sky there was a problem. The bomb doors wouldn't open. Ice from the extremely cold temperatures at the plane's high altitude had frozen the bomb racks in place, and they didn't deploy with the rest of the bombs from the other American planes, so as the rest of the B-17s accelerated forward, relieved of their heavy bomb loads, Cabin in the Sky lagged slightly behind. Lawley opened the throttle to try to compensate. Suddenly, the voices on the Cabin in the Sky's intercom called out another formation of Fokker Wolves, this time diving down from behind. With the sun at their backs, blinding the tail gunner, the Fokker Wolves ignored the deadly clouds of flak, whomping apart the sky around the Cabin in the Sky, and hurtled straight into the B-17 formation. Their 20mm cannons struck home at one nearby American bomber, catching its engines on fire and ungracefully dropping it out of the sky like a brick trailing a black cloud of smoke and flame. Another flak explosion hit even closer, rocking the Cabin in the Sky and peppering one of the engines with shards of metal, causing it to burst into flames. Lawley ordered the co-pilot to shut it down and kept moving. More calls came in. 6 o'clock low, 3 o'clock level. The Nazis were everywhere. The B-17s stuck close together like a herd of bison. or bison, knowing that the only way to survive was to stay close and lay down heavy fields of machine gun fire, as his gunners fired in every direction. Lolly looked through his cockpit window to see a fleet of 20 or so 190s drop down in front of him, pick out targets, and open fire with a deafening crash. A 20mm high-explosive autocannon shell burst through the front window of Kevin in the Sky, exploding in the cockpit. Everything went black. Lolly snapped awake seconds later, his ears ringing as if he'd been inside the church bell when it was pulled. Alarms were going off all across his console, which was now decorated with shards of shrapnel. Through blurry vision, Lolly saw that his co-pilot slumped over dead, his body lying on the control stick, pushing it forward. The plane was in a deep dive, making it all the worse by the fact that it had loaded bomb racks. The pilot's side window was smashed, and broken glass had gotten to Lolly's face, arms, and side. The windshield was so smeared with blood and oil that he could barely see out of it. Another engine was on fire. Amazingly, Lieutenant William Lolly didn't panic. He did his job. Determined to keep his plane and his crew alive, the veteran U.S. Army Air Force pilot reached out with his right arm, grabbed the dead co-pilot, and somehow pulled him back off the controls. Then with his left hand, Lolly manually fought a 27-ton bomber aircraft out of a 90-degree nose dive at 12,000 feet, leveled it off, and shut down the second burning engine. Looking up, he saw the Focke-Wulf pilot circling around for another pass, so this grim warrior made an evasive turn, dove the plane out down into the cloud cover, and accelerated out of there as fast as he could. Other B-17s in the formation had radioed Kevin in the Sky as killed in action, but somehow William Lolly managed to evade the enemy fighters and get the heck out of Leipzig. He flew across Germany, dodging enemy AA positions, then flew in low over the French countryside and ordered the surviving 8 members of his crew to grab parachutes and bail out. Unfortunately, all 8 crewmen had been wounded in the attack, and 2 of them were hurt so badly they couldn't possibly go skydiving right now. Nobody jumped out of the plane. The bombardier eventually got the racks unstuck and released his bombs over an unimportant part of the French countryside. But before long, another squadron of ME-109 fighters picked up the wounded B-17 on radar and came swooping in for the kill, with his injured guys moving to their guns to spray 50 caliber machine gun fire. Lolly hammered the stick of his crippled plane, dodging and evading with one arm and somehow eluding the enemy fighters again. In the process, however, he had to use more fuel than he had liked, and one of the 2 remaining engines was now almost out of gas. Despite Lolly's briefly passing out from lack of blood and then being reviewed by his bombardier, Cannon in the Sky somehow reached the English Channel. Against all odds, received emergency landing permission from a Canadian fighter base on the English coast. And just in case you're wondering how this possibly could get any worse, when William Lolly hit the button to drum his landing gear wheels, you guessed it, they didn't deploy. So, limping in with 3 burned out engines and feathering his only working one by pumping it off and with small amounts of gas, Lieutenant William Lolly, who was half blinded by broken glass, was exhausted from loss of blood, and had no landing gear, 8 wounded crew members, and 1 good arm, attempted to crash land an 18-ton flying fortress on a grass airfield about the size of a soccer field. He came in hard on his belly, sliding across the airfield, finally coming to a rest just outside of the Canadian barracks. Every remaining member of his crew survived. Lolly would walk out of the wreckage, spend a few weeks in the hospital, and make a full recovery. He went on to successfully pilot 4 more bombing missions before the war was over.